You seem more willing, interested, and I must say, maybe more conservative than I thought you were. Is that a fair assessment?
Not at all,
Okay.
because I am so not political you can't even believe.
We're going to have a look at a conversation slash debate between David Pakman and Dr. Phil. And this one cracks me up because David Pakman accuses Dr. Phil of being a conservative, like it's some kind of bad thing. And really, I don't think that Dr. Phil is either conservative nor Democrat. And Dr. Phil defends himself simply by referring to today's climate in America and how it relates to American families being affected. David Pakman then presumes himself to be the smartest man in the room, which is never the case, especially when Dr. Phil is in the house. And I'm not saying that Dr. Phil is the smartest guy, the end-all be-all of knowledge, but when it comes to his opinion versus David Pakman, I believe I would side with Dr. Phil 99 out of 100 times. This one was a fun watch for me, and I think you guys are going to enjoy it too, so let's go ahead and check it out.
Today we'll be speaking with Phil McGraw, also known as Dr. Phil, host of Dr. Phil Prime Time on Merritt Street Media, and author of the new book, We've Got Issues, How You Can Stand Strong for America's Soul and Sanity. You know, I'm very interested to speak to you today because in preparation for our interview, I've been watching some of the Fox News appearances, looking at the book, etc. I never really saw you as a guy who delved into political issues per se. You seem more willing, interested, and I must say, maybe more conservative than I thought you were. Is that a fair assessment?
Not at all.
Okay.
Because I am so not political you can't even believe it. And I'll tell you why. I know nothing about politics. And I know why you say that. It sounds like it.
Right.
I talk about these things as cultural issues from a psychological, psychosocial standpoint, how they affect families and people. And they do overlap with some of the things that politicians talk about, but they talk about it from a political standpoint, funding standpoint, how they can get this bill or that bill through, couldn't care less. But I am interested in those issues in terms of how they impact families in their day-to-day pursuit of life and peace and being able to raise their family in a healthy environment. So there's a lot of overlap, but I don't talk about it from a political standpoint because I frankly don't know enough about the politics of it all.
That's
I'm just
interesting.
willing to admit that. I'm just willing to admit it. I don't think a lot of other people know either. I'm just willing to admit it.
I don't want to make this like, famously there's this story of literary critics were talking about the symbolism in Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451, and he would tell them, that's not at all what I meant. And so I don't want to make this where I tell you about how political all the stuff you say is, but the reason why I say it is a lot of the language in the book, and when you talk about issues like immigration and culture and others, it seems as though it alludes to going back to the good old days, individual decisions in the style that many Republicans now talk about with regard to schooling and parenting, et cetera. But you're saying it's just not the case.
No, and that doesn't mean that there aren't politicians on both sides of the aisle that talk about these issues. But if you really think about raising a family in America, whether it's now or 50 years ago or 20 years down the road, we still have to keep our eye on what I think are core issues in America. And I think the backbone of America is the family unit. I really think that if we have strong families, if we have strong family values, and I think that our families in America, as you've heard me say and read me say, are under attack. And I think some of those attacks are unintended consequences of technology, for example. But these are things that, whether politicians talked about them or not, if they tried to legislate about them or not, I would still be talking about.
So give some examples of that. What are some of the attacks facing families?
Well, I think about 08, 09, we had what I think has been the biggest change to human life since the Industrial Revolution. I think before the Industrial Revolution, we were a very agricultural civilization, right? People worked on the farms. We grew what we needed. But then we became mechanized, and I think back then we were 95% agricultural. Now we're 1% agricultural. Why? Because everything is so mechanized and people move to the cities and all. Well, the biggest thing that's happened since then, in my opinion, was the advent of the smartphone. The internet became so prolific. And I mean, think about it. We're walking around in 08, 09 with as much computing power in our hands with smartphones, laptops, iPads, that we had when we did the moon shot. When we put a man on the moon, we didn't have as much computing power as we can hold in our hands as of 08, 09, and it changed everything. And people stopped being so involved with the reality of life and started getting involved in virtual life. And it's only gone more and more in that direction since that time. And also at that time, we started seeing the highest levels of anxiety, depression, and loneliness in young people since records were kept. And
I'm with you on this
changed.
one. I'm with you on this one. Jonathan Haidt has studied and written about this extensively. You and I are aligned on this one. What about the ones that fall under what you call the tyranny of the fringe? Because I don't think the smartphone example falls under that category, right?
No, that's why I say some of this is the unintended consequences of like technology. But then we've got some where we've got people that are just trying to change some of the core values in America, core values of family, trying to rewrite history. And we've got people that are coming in saying, well, we want to change history, we want to change what kids are being taught in history, we want to change biology, we want to change all of the things that we have for 100 years had empirical data to support.
But tell me more. I don't want to gloss over this. I really want to understand this. Changing history. Okay, what was the history that used to be taught that now has been changed by the tyranny of the fringe?
Well, pick an area. We can talk about biology, where we have always had two sexes.
But what about history? Just to pick history, not biology, because you said history, biology. What about history?
And that's one of the problems with progressives, right? Especially like David Pakman, he calls himself a progressive. You know, he's going to go out there and for the sake of progress, going to conveniently forget history and the biology that is involved in history. It's like, no, don't talk about biology. Let's talk about history. It's like, hold up there, bud. We've known since the creation of mankind that there's only two sexes. But now, for the sake of progress, all these progressives and Democrats and everybody over there, they want to come at you and say that there's actually 900 different sexes or whatever it is. I don't even know. I lost track, and I don't even care to keep count. But Dr. Phil leads with this one example, and David Pakman can't handle what he's about to hear. So he cuts him off and says, no, talk about actual history. And it's like, Dr. Phil's pause right there says it all. It's like one of those times where a person thinks like a million words in 1 second. And I just wish I could know what Dr. Phil was thinking right there, because I have a feeling he realized that David Pakman is a complete moron and began to wonder why he's even having this interview.
Well, there's a lot of history to biology, and you would be missing a big point to pretend that there's not historical biology. But if you want to talk about history, we can not in biology, but just talk about the history of mankind.
Yeah.
We've got areas where they don't want to talk about slavery. We had one group of people that wanted to start describing slavery in history books as involuntary relocation.
Right.
This was not involuntary relocation. This was slavery. And we've got people that are wanting to rename schools because people that were doing what were the mores and folkways of the times now would clearly be doing things against the law, certainly against mores and folkways, because they were slave owners at the time, are saying, well, now we have to tear down these statues, we have to rename these schools, and we don't want to teach about them. we have to learn from our mistakes as a society. We can't pretend those things didn't happen. They did happen. They were dark and ugly times in American history. We don't want to pretend those things weren't there.
So let me see if I
That's
understand,
crazy.
because there's a bunch of stuff. So if I hear you correctly, you're not in agreement with those who want to minimize the tragedy and brutality of slavery, but you also want to keep the school names. If a school is named after a slave owner, you're also okay with that because it will remind us and we will learn from it. Am I understanding that correctly?
I think you're oversimplifying what I'm saying. What I'm
Okay.
saying is, if you're wanting to change American history to pretend that these people did not exist, and you want to measure them by today's yardstick rather than the yardstick at the time, that's what is referred to as presentism. And that's like saying, okay, you're going to drive through a neighborhood and the speed limit is 20. And you drive through that neighborhood doing 20, and then they come along and say, you know what, we're going to change the speed limit to 10, and we're going to give you a ticket for speeding when the speed limit was 20. It's now 10, but you weren't speeding when you were doing 20, but now it's 10. We're going to give you a retroactive ticket for doing what was acceptable at the time. That's called presentism. We're going to take what was done back at the time, pull it up into the current time, and condemn you for not knowing what was going to be acceptable 200 years later than when you did it. And I think that is really narcissistic and arrogant and rewriting history instead of letting people learn from the mistakes that were made in America and that we need to learn from so we don't make those mistakes again. Because some of those people also did some really good things at the time. We don't need to endorse everything they did, but we need to acknowledge the good and the bad.
And that right there, I believe, is something that America has dominated on the world scale as it relates to learning from your mistakes and moving forward for the betterment of the people. A lot of the worst parts of our history are just that, history. They're not implemented in today's society at all, although there are a lot of people out there that will try to claim systemic this or systemic that, when the reality is there's maybe bad individuals, but the system is not designed anymore, at least in my opinion, to hold people back or prevent them from chasing and achieving their own American dream.
When it comes to cancel culture, something you've also written and spoken about, what do you think is the prototypical or emblematic example of someone who was unfairly canceled over the last few years?
Well, I think the idea of cancel culture is more than one person, and I'm not going to speak specifically about one person. What I'm going to say is you've got people that want their speech instead of free speech. And so they will come in and talk about in a university certain things that can't be shared, can't be talked about. We've got universities that have put out language that they highly recommend their professors to not use. One of them that jumps out at me from the University of California is they were encouraged to no longer say America is the land of opportunity, or the job should go to the most qualified person. They were saying you can't say those things anymore because they are considered to be oppressive. And if you have university faculty, even tenured faculty, that talk about those things or ask their students to take positions that are contrary to what they believe, what the students believe, they get grieved against, they get suspended, they get disciplined. and in a sense canceled at that point.
That's
They've
interesting.
lost-
Let me weigh in on that a little bit because that's very interesting. In preparation for the interview, I looked at the academic setting because a lot of times when we talk about cancellation, we talk about, a comedian who said or did something and then for a while they didn't have shows or something like that, Louis C.K., for example, et cetera. I looked for the revocation of tenure for professors in a lot of these schools that you talk about or allude to. And really, it seems that when tenure is being stripped, it's for real wrongdoing. Plagiarism is uncovered, sexual harassment of students, et cetera. I really struggle to find evidence in a country of 330 million people of tenure being stripped just because of using the wrong language. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't wacky memos that go out, or I'm with you that this stuff exists anecdotally. But if we think about what is happening big picture, I actually struggle to really find examples of this as an epidemic. Tell me where I may be missing something.
Well, I don't know what you mean by epidemic.
Well, that it's happening, that professors are being stripped of tenure, not for serious violations of their like I said, sexual harassment, plagiarism, being involved in criminality, but just because they said something that is maybe not politically correct. I'm just not seeing that tenure is being stripped from professors for that. Do you have any examples of professors that have lost tenure in that way?
I do, and I'll provide it to you. How's that? I'll get you a list and send it to you.
That would be, I would love to do that, because if that is happening, I want to expose that, and I want to talk about that. Couple other things that I wanted to ask you about. When it comes to what you see happening in the political space right now, approaching it from a cultural perspective, as you say that you do you agree that a decline in religiosity is a problem in the United States, or is that not a concern to you?
It is a concern to me. I think we've seen church membership drop below the 50% mark for the first time in our country's history. And I think that that's a problem for a variety of reasons. And one of them being that that's one of the times that families tend to spend quality time together. It's time that they put their phones down. It's time that they usually got together and would go do something as a unit and focus on values that were constructive to the family. There was often meditation time involved. There was often discussions about what was discussed in church that day. They often had Sunday dinner together afterwards and spent quality time like they did no other time during the day. And I think it also is a product of our lessened birth rate, which has dropped because a lot of people join church when they have children because they want their child to be baptized or christened or whatever. And the fact that we've seen our birth rate drop to around 1.6 from 2.1, which is necessary to sustain our infrastructure right now, is a problem. And it seems that that's one of the main reasons that church membership has dropped off. There's fewer kids to go get baptized, christened, or whatever, so people have less reason to go to church, and that's a byproduct of the lesser birth rate.
What do you make of the correlation, anyway, that as church attendance has declined, which you rightly point out, the rate of violent crime and murder in the United States has also been declining? Do you think there's anything because a lot of times the claim is made that as you remove God, whether it's from school or whatever, bad things happen, crime rates go up, etc. But we continue to see violent crime rates decline in the United States, correlating with decreased church attendance. What do you make of that?
You know what? We can all tell that Dr. Phil is over your dumbass questions there, so I'll answer that question for him. The reason why crime is down is because none of the DAs in the most heavily populated blue Democrat-ran cities are willing to prosecute. They give them a slap on the wrist and put people back on the streets the next day, the very same day that they're arrested for doing the crime. We read the articles, we see the stories over and over and over on a daily basis that this person that just did crime A was arrested for crime B earlier that day or the day before or the week before that. And it's like, wait a minute, why wasn't that person in jail? Why wasn't that person being held accountable? Well, it's because they're trying to reduce the numbers systemically, right? We're talking about systemic things. The Democrats like to talk about systemic this or that. Well, systemically, they're trying to reduce the number of crime by not holding people accountable. And when you have lighter punishments for such crimes, people are more inclined to do them. FAFO, everybody knows that. And when people FA and then they realize that the find out part wasn't so bad, they FA again and again and again until finally, eventually, somebody is truly a victim. And in a lot of cases, it ends up with an innocent victim losing their life or something like that along those lines, a truly violent crime from a person that should have been locked up and prosecuted and held accountable way, way ahead of time, especially as it relates to illegal immigration coming into our country. And I know the progressives, the Democrats, all these people want to say, oh, but the crime rate from illegal immigrants is less than the crime rate percentage-wise from people that are actually American citizens. Well, that doesn't matter to me. What matters is the total amount of crime and the fact that these people aren't being held accountable because they're not being prosecuted and held accountable. And in my opinion, when you add more people, that adds to the total pool of crime being committed. I don't care if their percentage is lower or higher or any, really. It needs to be zero. And we need to reduce the amount of crime that's going on within our own citizens, but not by prosecuting less and letting people get away with more. That's not how you truly reduce crime. That's not how you protect the innocent citizens of our country. And then at the same time, on the other hand, you have people who are being over-prosecuted and, being held accountable for things that they did when they were, defending innocent folks, like the guy in New York who accidentally killed the dude that was attacking a woman. He was just defending the woman, the innocent woman who was under attack from the man, and he ended up accidentally choking him for too long or whatever the case was, right? And so then that guy's held accountable for murder and all this other stuff. And really, he was just acting in self-defense for a person who couldn't do it themselves. And then, that's that's the person that gets prosecuted and jailed and, countless news articles written about and things like that. So, I don't know. When the whole justice system is completely out of whack and these prosecutors are looking at skin color rather than the crime, looking at ethnicity, looking at, country of origin over the crime that's being committed, you realize that the example that David Pakman just used right there, that as people stop going to church, crime is coincidentally going down, that is completely absurd. That notion is completely out of line, and anybody with anybody with two brain cells to rub together realizes that the more people that are serving God, the more people that are going to church regularly, the more people that are implementing the values that a good church instills into a community, the better off and the safer that community is. So David Pakman's an idiot. Dr. Phil, you could tell by the end, was completely ready to go to sleep. He realized about halfway through that this is not the interview that he should be spending his time on, but he went ahead because he has integrity and finished it out. But if you're watching closely, it appears that Dr. Phil is about ready to go to sleep. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up. I hope you guys enjoyed this one. If you did, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, share this video, and I'll see you guys in the next one.